The focus of today's video is going to be the savior of the Melee DPS race, or at least it looks like it, because after we went through the tier list, the ranking, the power level of the healers and then the tanks, as we started dividing our lists between melee and ranged, there is something that is worth our attention to put some focus on, because as we go through the beta and you look at the results and the power level of the DPS and how they have been doing so far, there is something we couldn't even call unique, because it did happen a few times in the past, which is the fact that you get to see multiple casters, multiple ranged DPS specs being highly valued right now in the beta. You have specs like Demo, Warlock, you have specs like Arcane, you have specs like Augmentation. We're also counting Devourer as a caster. Other popular range have been Marksmanship Hunter, Fire Mage recently over Frost Mage, which has lost more, Elemental Shaman. However, who stands on top alone as a opposite to all of this is Unholy DK. The only one melee being as popular. The closest one is Survival, which is like played less than a third than Unholy, and if we're talking about high level keys in the beta, Unholy is like 7 times more played than Survival, which is the second best. So it was relevant to point this out. Why is Unholy being so strong right now? What is improving in Midnight? Because, you know, right now Unholy is already being played in the pre-patch, is already very strong, is already a meta spec. You have gotten the talent changes in the pre-patch already, and what is unique is that if you compare the damage, if you compare how they work, this is the pre-patch and this is the beta of Midnight, you can see there is quite the difference in how they are doing damage. This is very heavily impacted by two things, of course, two things you don't have in the pre-patch. One is the tier set, and two are the Apex talents. So while you might have gotten used to how the new version of Unholy works in the pre-patch with the lesser ghouls, as you build up the stacks from your Festering strike and then you consume them with Scourge strike, you summon these ghouls and then you do damage, there is something quite unique now happening thanks to what you're getting in Midnight. Let's start first, you know, with the hint. This is the hint of what's to come, which is your tier set. Your tier set gives you something that is good for all hero talents, all builds. It's just a very neutral buff. Putrefy, doing 20% increased damage and causing your next Scourge strike to cost no rune. This is quite neutral. What is much less neutral is the 2-piece set bonus. 25% increased damage to disease number 1, 25% increased damage to disease number 2. So obviously there is quite the hint here for you to be playing for more disease damage in Midnight, which is what is happening. Even if you compare, you know, pre-patch versus beta of Midnight, and there is still Sun Lane, what is being played in the beta is quite different than what is being played in live. What gives you the further push towards this new style that you will have to play with the Apex talents? The first rank of the Apex talent is also very neutral. When you use Army of the Dead, you get an empowered Death Coil and an empowered Epidemic. Pretty much the only difference between the two is that once you use this, you can keep using Death Coil on up to 4 targets. Or, you know, Necrotic Coil on up to 4 targets, because now it cleaves, so it makes it better for you on 2-3 target cleave, which was usually the dead zone of Unholy, you know, between 1 target Death Coil and like 15 targets Epidemic. The smaller target number was a bit of a weaker point. Now with Army of the Dead you have a stronger cleave, but ultimately for the different builds this Apex talent is neutral. It's good for every build. What is significantly different is, first, second Apex talent, Putrefy, causing your next Scourge strike to summon a lesser ghoul, so now you can generate the extra spawning of the lesser ghouls, not just with Festering strike, but also with Putrefys, and Mastery gain. Good. You know, gaining these small buffs could be good for certain burst windows, if you have any, which we will see you have a very big one with this build. The second point, the last point of your Apex talent, one is currently under construction in the sense that it doesn't really work because this entire point around the Magus of the Dead, which is another way you might be building your talents at the moment, is a bit too weak, so it's not really being played. But what is much stronger and much more used in this version of the build is that Dread Plague, your second disease, the one that can only be attached on 1 target, has a 20% chance to rouse the dead, causing a lesser ghoul to unhurt and leap at the target to putrefy at 60% effectiveness. Now, back to the previous Apex talent. Putrefy causes your next Scourge Strike to summon a lesser ghoul, and this works with the one that procs for free from the third Apex talent. You can see in this clip, I only use Festering Strike and Festering Scythe on pool. So I start the entire pool with 6 stacks of my summoning of ghouls. And I'm able to continue. I'm able to continue for 40 plus seconds of this without clicking Festering Strike again. I am generating free summons of ghouls from my Putrefy cast and from my Apex talent. That's how often I can sustain these stacks of ghoul spawning without actually having to click on my Festering Strike, something you don't right now have available in the pre-patch because you don't have the Apex talents. That is very good for your sustain of stacks of your ghoul summoning, having the Apex talent to give you a whole bunch of them for free, both from Putrefy and from your extra spawns of your lesser ghouls casting Putrefy for you. That's the main major benefit of this Apex talent, and that you can also get this mastery stack every time you Putrefy. Now, what turns the build into what we see in the beta compared to what we see in the pre-patch is Pestilence. The nerfed Pestilence, which used to consume all the duration, all of your dots for 150% of the damage, nerfed recently to only 100% of the damage. Didn't matter, it's still the way to play the spec. This will essentially be seen as a mega ramp. You essentially hold on and hold on and hold on, and you try to extend the duration of your dots to be as long as possible so that when you consume them, you do as much damage as you can. Because obviously, you know, I've been told by a team of mathematicians, if a dot does 1000 damage per second and lasts for 18 seconds, versus a dot that does 1000 damage per second and lasts for 55 seconds. When you consume the dot that lasted for 55 seconds, the amount of burst damage you will be able to do will be much, much bigger. Precisely, almost precisely, 3 times as big, for example. Now, this gets entirely enabled by Sunlane, a talent that has caused some problems before and is back to cause problems again. It's Infliction of Sorrow. Besides the fact that Infliction of Sorrow also causes plagues to erupt at 30% effectiveness, you already have Scourging, which erupts them at 70% effectiveness. Now, on top of that, you also have the 30% extra of Infliction of Sorrow. But what's even better, far better, is that now Vampiric Strike also extends the duration of the plagues by 3 seconds. And you already have your spenders, both the AoE or the single target one, Epidemic and Death Coil, to extend it by 1.5 seconds. And then, because you play with Blight Burst, every time you Putrefy, you also extend the duration of your diseases by 4 seconds. So, what this means, as you see in the clip, is that you are able to extend quite easily your 2 main dots on the main target you're hitting, Virulent Plague and Dread Plague, by well past 50 seconds. So the play here is to last as long as you can, keep alternating, because of course you won't have infinite runes to just spam Vampiric Strike. Alternate Vampiric Strike and Epidemic, Vampiric Strike and Epidemic, or in single target Vampiric Strike and Death Coil, or in fewer targets inside of Army of the Dead, as we said, the upgraded Death Coil, Necrotic Coil. Just alternate the two as you keep building up and up and up the duration of these dots. And then when you are towards the end, when you've built them up enough, you use the last few tools you have to make this number, this Pestilence dot consumption, to be as big as possible. And the way you make this happen is that, number one, as you play with Sunlane, you consume Sudden Doom, because when you consume Sudden Doom as Sunlane, you gain 4% strength, which of course will give you more damage. This has been also recently nerfed. I think it used to be 8% strength, now it's only 4, but it's still good. So right before you press Pestilence, you also consume your Sudden Doom to gain 4% strength. Then, right before consuming Pestilence, you use Soul Reaper, because you do play with Soul Reaper and with Reaping. Reaping makes Dark Transformation reset Soul Reaper's cooldown and allows it to be used on any target, even if they are not below 35% HP. And luckily, this buff to Soul Reaper lasts for 20 seconds, so you're able to hold on to this Soul Reaper usable on all targets for up to 20 seconds. And the reason why you want to wait to use this so that Soul Reaper will be on the target when you press Pestilence. That Soul Reaper makes the enemy take 20% increased damage from your diseases, which is what Pestilence is about to consume. What makes this doubly better is that Soul Reaper also instantly consumes all available charges of Putrefy. And we just mentioned what happens when you cast Putrefy. Number one, Blight Burst extends the duration of the dots already, so it's very good because Pestilence then will do more damage since you have extended the duration of the dots. But then your Apex talent also gives you Stack in Mastery. So if you add 2 stacks of Putrefy, you consume them both instantly and you also gain 12% Mastery. Mastery for DK, for Unholy, is Pet and Shadow damage. Both of your dots are also shadow damage and they're also affected by your Mastery. So right before you consume the dots you have just built up with your Pestilence to consume them all, you gain the 4% strength from Visceral Strength, you gain the 20% more damage from Soul Reaper, you gain the 12% more Mastery from using 2 Putrefys, and then you blow them up with Pestilence. That's the result and the entire cycle of play of the new build of Sunlane Unholy DK in the beta. All entirely centered around Pestilence and around extending the dots on the main target as long as possible to make the dot duration as big as possible so that when you suck them in with Pestilence you got tons of damage. Now, what are the negatives, the problems of this build, of the way Unholy plays right now with this style? Well, problem number one, obviously it gets weaker and weaker the longer you wait if more and more enemies are dying, because this makes you, every time you pull, wait at least 20 seconds or at more or less 20 seconds before you do this. So you need to hope that mobs last for more than 20 seconds or about 20 seconds. Otherwise, if they start dying earlier, you have to use Pestilence earlier, which means you want to be able to extend the duration of your dots that long. It does make using your CDs pretty simple, after all, with Dark Transformation having a 45-second cooldown and Army of the Dead having a 90-second cooldown. It's just simple. You macro them together, since Dark Transformation isn't even on the GCD, so you just macro DT and Army together. One time they come together, the second time it's only Dark Transformation, and the third time they are back together. They just line up perfectly, because with Dark Transformation you can extend the duration of the Abomination, but you don't reduce the cooldown of the button. So the button will always line up with Army of the Dead every time. So in terms of CDs, it's very, very straightforward. There might be some slight, thinking. For example, imagine a pool is slightly too long, so by the time you are halfway through the pool, your Dark Transformation comes back off cooldown and you're like, should I use it? Do I even have time to build up the dots for 15 seconds before I explode them with Pestilence, or will the mobs all be dead anyways, so it's a waste? And then when we get into the next pool, which is a big triple pack, very large pool, my Dark Transformation is still on cooldown for 20 seconds and I lose tons of damage. That's about the biggest thinking you have to do with your CDs as Unholy. The other problem for Unholy is target swapping when you are doing this. It's a major issue for Unholy because when you use Dark Transformation, your main way to apply Dread Plague, so your single target, your prio damage focus plague, which only goes on one target, becomes unusable because Outbreak becomes replaced by Pestilence. So you can no longer swap your main single target plague to another mob. You can do it with Putrefy, because Putrefy now also applies your diseases on the target if you don't have them. If you play with Blight Burst, which of course you do, Putrefy applies them for you. But what's the problem here? The problem is that you are trying to build a big, long duration Dread Plague on one mob. Now you are up to like 40 seconds. You were trying to bring it up to like 55. And then you want to target swap. So you putrefy a different mob. When you putrefy a different mob, you apply the base duration of your dots, which is 18 seconds. So your Dread Plague, which was at 40 seconds on your main target, as you target swap, goes all the way back down to 18 seconds. It doesn't transfer your longest duration Dread Plague to a new target. It creates a brand new one in its base duration. This makes target swapping very awkward for Unholy DK. because you cannot move basically your biggest single target dot damage debuff on a different enemy while you are inside Dark Transformation, unless you want to lose the extension of the dots you have been building. That's the one weakness for DK in terms of damage profile. Besides that, the other benefit that we always look at when we're talking about the Mythic Plus power level of a spec is the single target funnel, the single target prio damage on one main target. So you're hitting 10 mobs, but one of these mobs is super important, so can you do more damage to that mob while you do AoE? Or does your AoE just hit everyone the same? Unholy doesn't really have too many ways to do prio damage on a particular mob. A lot of your damage is just spread everywhere. Almost all of your buttons, from Vampiric Strike, cleaving multiple enemies, Virulent Plague, the explosion of both Virulent and Red Plague, your Epidemic, the upgraded Epidemic Graveyard, even Death Coil, when it gets upgraded by Army, becomes a 4-target cleave. So your single target prio damage is still weak. You wouldn't be taken in a Mythic Plus key to be the guy that does the focus damage on one enemy. That would still be a spec like Arcane Mage, for example. Your damage is still way more in the blanket, wide, spread to everyone kind of AoE damage. You would be more similar to a spec, talking about meta specs right now, a specs like Demology Warlock, or even Frost Mage, and less so about a specs like Arcane Mage, or even Assassination Rogue, or Sub Rogue, etc, etc. So in terms of damage profile, your niche, your pocket, your slot in Mythic Plus would be very high, consistent AoE damage. Besides this, the spec doesn't really have that much nuance left. Perhaps the only other most important thing to keep track of in your entire rotation, besides building every 40-ish seconds these windows of Pestilence, would be to try to consume Sudden Doom. Not even because of the damage, you know, Sudden Doom damage bonus to your spenders, because your spenders do quite pathetic damage, especially outside of the empowerment of your Apex, so outside of Army of the Dead. Epidemic, both Epidemic and Death Call do very little damage anyways. You mostly at this point use them to enable other things, you know, to give you things like extension of your dots, for example, or in the case of consuming Sudden Doom, making sure you get to consume Sudden Doom is because of Doom bidding, for example. Consuming it, giving you extra lesser ghouls to spawn, and because, as we mentioned, Visceral Strength, gaining 4% strength for 5 seconds. So if you're able to continuously keep up Sudden Doom consumptions, you keep having this 4% strength buff. That's the main thing. Outside of your make sure you extend the dots before you suck them in with Pestilence kind of rotation, the rest is to keep up Sudden Doom procs and expand them, don't let them sit at 2 stacks, etc, etc. This is what at the moment is making Unholy DK so strong in the beta, even despite the significant nerfs they have received to this entire playstyle. Just a few days ago, the dots were nerfed, the Pestilence was nerfed, both of your spenders were nerfed. The spec is still doing tons of damage. We will see by the time we get to release if once again both Magus of the Dead and Reanimation get buffed again to try to make this alternative playstyle around your Magus damage more viable compared to what currently you get from Pestilence, the Pestilence build. But for now, this is what has made Unholy DK meta. And what we wanted to highlight before we went over the rankings and the power levels of the other DPS specs as a whole, to highlight the current shiniest member of the Melee DPS category right now in the beta. So, for today, at the beginning of this new week, which will also be the week of the release of the early access of the new expansion, that's what we have for the specs review of the soon to come to a close at this point beta of Midnight. So, for today, it is now time to leave each other. We are starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competi for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, you know what? It's not even that long. I was hoping for a 15-minute-ish benchmark, but we are kind of still fine. I'll take it.